Hello guys, welcome to a new video of Fischer series. Today we have a really interesting matchup. Fischer Reshevsky 1961. A beautiful clash of generations. Reshevsky being a former 8-time US champion, facing this new chess prodigy, Fischer at the age of 18 and now 4-time US champion. It was a long-awaited match and a lot of masters abroad, Bent Larsen, Gligoric, Petrosian, Keres, they all predicted Reshevsky to win this matchup. It was played at the Empire Hotel in New York, and some games would also be played in Los Angeles. 40 moves in 2.5 hours, and the other moves would be adjourned the next day. And actually, Reshevsky won the toss for game number 1, so he had the white pieces to begin with. I can't wait to show you some beautiful games. Let's just dive straight into it. Fischer has the black pieces, and Reshevsky starts with d4. Knight to f6, c4 and g6. Knight to c3, bishop g7, going for the King's Indian. e4, so this is all theory. d6, bishop e2, castles, and knight to f3. And Fischer strikes with e5. And actually it looks like a free pawn. After takes, the knight can take it. But actually, then we have queen takes, bishop takes, and we win the pawn back on e4. And after knight takes, bishop takes, it's an equal position, and white didn't really achieve anything. So that's why Reshevsky doesn't take. He simply develops by castling here. Now knight comes to c6, wanting to provoke d5 push. Fischer wants white to play d5 and then play knight to e7, in which he wants to prepare f5. But Reshevsky doesn't bite. He plays bishop e3, even though d5 is a really good move actually. But he keeps the tension in the center. And now knight to g4, going after this bishop. But by playing knight to g4, there's only one good move for white, and Reshevsky finds it. Bishop g5, moving the bishop twice. And we have moved our knight to g4, attacking the bishop, so it looks a bit dull to bring it back to f6. But moving away the queen is not an option either, because then we have knight to d5, double attack on the e7 square with the bishop and the knight. If we attack the knight, we have h3, and your knight is trapped. If you bring it to h6, bishop takes, and we have a fork, and you can resign. So that's why in this position, Fischer actually just gives away his bishop. His strong dark squared bishop defending the dark squares around the king. Now bishop takes, knight takes, and now d5 by Reshevsky. Knight to e7. And here, knight back to e1, because Reshevsky can see that with knight to e7, Fischer wants to move away his other knight, and his pawn chain is facing towards the king side, so Fischer would like to open up on the king side with f5. So he moves away his knight to also make way for the f4 push. Now knight comes to d7, knight to d3, and f5 by Fischer. And here actually taking is not so good, because then we take back with the pawn and we have a lot of control over some squares here. We can even take with the knight and jump to d4 later on. But if you do not take and play a slow move like h3, then Fischer would play f4 later. g5, g4, move away the king, rook to g8, and just attack on the king side. So here perhaps the best move would be f4. But Reshevsky played e takes f5. Now g takes f5, and here he plays f4. The best move. And it looks like we can push through, but then we actually weaken the d4 square, which we were controlling. Knight will go to e1, it will rotate to c2, to d4, perhaps attack this pawn, maybe jump to e6 later on. So that's why Fischer doesn't push here. He plays knight to g6. Now the queen develops to d2, connecting the rooks, and rook to e8. And rook to e8 could be a little inaccuracy, because it was defending the f5 pawn, and maybe better would be knight to f6 to develop our knight towards the king side and defend the pawn like this, and perhaps bring the queen to e7 later on. But by playing rook to e8, now Reshevsky takes the pawn, best move, and here we have to take with the knight, because if we take with the rook, for example, we lose the rook, and if we take with the pawn, then we lose the f5 pawn. So knight takes, now knight takes e5, and rook takes e5. But look at this f5 pawn. It's an isolated pawn, which is really weak here. So Reshevsky will try to attack it. And he starts doing so by playing one of the best moves, knight to b5. Well, why is knight to b5 a good move? After bishop to d7, here, to justify knight to b5, we would have to bring it to d4 and attack the pawn, bishop to d3, have more pressure, queen to c2, and just attack this pawn with all our pieces. But here Reshevsky starts doing so by playing bishop to d3. But now we can actually take the knight. And after bishop takes knight, you have doubled pawns and an isolated pawn yourself. So perhaps better would have been knight to d4 here. But okay, bishop to d3, bishop takes b5, and pawn takes. And we have double pawns here and an isolated pawn on d5. Now queen goes to d7 and queen to f2. And queen to f2 is a bit of a problem. We have a triple attack on this pawn now, with the rook, the queen, and the bishop, and we only defend it once. Well, if we try to, well, we actually defend it twice, but if we try to bring another piece defending it, then the pawn on a7 is falling. So we either lose the f5 pawn or the a7 pawn here. So Fischer's like, well, let me just push the pawn then because I'm going to lose it anyway. Now Reshevsky takes the knight, and after a pawn takes, he takes the pawn on f4. And Reshevsky's up a pawn here. Well, it looks like we can take the d5 pawn. But if you take it now, it would be a bit greedy. Because our position is very unsafe here. We would have queen to e4, attacking the rook and attacking the g6 pawn. And if you try to defend with rook to f5, we can take the b7 pawn. So that's why here you shouldn't take yet. First rook a to e8. Now rook a to d1, defending the pawn. And queen goes to g7, defending some squares around the king. Now h3, making way for the king to come up. Rook to e7, attacking the b2 pawn. Rook goes to d2. And now rook to e4. And he could have played rook to e4 immediately, but then the rooks were still connected. And by playing rook to e7, rook to d2, and rook to e4, now the rooks are not connected, so the queen jumps back to f2. And now b6, making sure those doubled pawns are fixed. And now comes a3. Rook goes to e5. Putting some pressure on the d5 pawn, queen to f6, and Fischer actually takes the queen. And after rook takes, he develops his king to g7, rook drops back to f2, and now king to h6, slowly marching our king up. Since it cannot march this way, so we go to h6, g5, h4, and just come up. So king to h2, and now rook to c4, a really nice move, wanting to go to c5 and take this pawn. And here Reshevsky plays rook to c2, and after rook takes, we take the pawn back, and it's equal material. And here Reshevsky could take the pawn on c7, but after rook takes, and rook takes, this just leads to a draw. So Reshevsky doesn't take the pawn yet. After rook takes d5, he plays a4, defending his b5 pawn. And here there's only one move for black to keep the game equal. I would say try to pause the video now and find the drawing move for Fischer. So the only move that works here is actually rook to c5. And Reshevsky wouldn't take here because then we take with the b pawn and we have a pass pawn rolling up the board. So he would play rook to c3, and now we do not want to take because after pawn takes, the black pawns are fixed here and we cannot create a passer, and white has a 2-on-1 on the king side, so he will create a passer and then sacrifice the pawn and take the other pawns. So we cannot take your rook either, so the rooks would have some kind of standoff here, facing each other. And there's no way for both sides to develop further. So this would lead to a draw. But Fischer actually went after the a4 pawn. Rook to d4. But that's a mistake. Because now we have b3. Now he goes after the b pawn. But now rook takes c7 and rook takes b3 and rook takes a7. And Reshevsky is up a pawn again. Now d5, Fischer tries to create a queen here. Rook to d7, rook to d3, rook to d6, and rook to d4. Now rook takes b6, rook takes a4. Reshevsky still up a pawn, 2 on the king side, 1 on the queen side. And here, the king comes up to g3. But that move actually draws the game. Why does it draw the game? Well, have a look at this position and find the only winning move for Reshevsky. So, the only winning move here is rook to d6. Since then we would have d4, b6, and rook to b4. And now, it's actually a funny position. The pawns cannot move and the rooks neither. So, they're just looking at each other. But now the king will come up to g3, king to g5, king to f3, king to f5. And now something like g4 check. And if you go to g5, the king will slowly come towards his passed pawn and secure it to the b8 square. And that's how white wins. So why does g3 played here draw the game? Because now after the rook moves, you see the pawn coming up, and now the king has to keep an eye on the pawn, and the rook has to defend the other pawn. So for example, now g5 by Fischer, and in this position, after king to f7, g3, here Fischer makes a mistake. But this is actually a draw. What he should have done is simply wait here. For example, king to g7. White will create a passer, but we just wait. And there's no way for you to develop further. If you check us, we take the pawn. If you try to go after this pawn, simply rook takes, and rook to b4. And the rook will cut off some lines in which the king cannot come close to the pawn. And the rook on its own cannot lure away the king. So this would simply be a draw. But in this position, after g3, Fischer played rook b2 check. And that's the losing move. Because now we have king takes d3. Fischer gives a check again. And now the king comes up to the pawn and will escort it towards b8. Okay, we do take a pawn on your king side. Now rook to h6, defending the pawn. King to g7. Simply rook to c6. Reshevsky doesn't really care about this pawn. Rook takes h3. And in this position, after b6, rook goes to h1, trying to defend the pawn. But simply king to b5. Rook gives a check. King to a6, rook a1 check. The king comes up to b7 to c7, and there's no way for you to defend the pawn in this position. So after g4, king to c8 here, rook to a6, and king to c7, simply b7, b8, queen. And Fischer resigned the game. This was a beautiful first game. I hope you liked this video. If so, please like, subscribe, or comment. And I'll see you on the next video. Bye bye.